Now, our coming speaker is Richard Fry, and I've never met him until I came today, but he goes across the nation at his own expense, talking against the Constitutional Convention that's being promoted. Anyway, he went and spoke at a debate in South Dakota. Was it Rapid City? Rapid City, which is one of the larger cities in South Dakota. Anyway, at the beginning of the debate, by raise of hands, they said who's in favor of a con and who's not. The majority of people raised their hands in favor of it. After the debate, the tables turned totally. And so after his debate and explaining the situation, the tables were turned and people felt educated. And I felt this was a good opportunity for him to be here and explain that situation to us, because I think it's an issue that we need to begin to address. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
How's that? Can everybody hear me? Yeah, I work with I'm a general counsel with an organization called Patriot Coalition that's out. It's a national organization promoting constitutional governance, which seems like we shouldn't have to do that, but I guess we do. And co-founder of an organization called Defend Not Amend, which is a national coalition of groups that are trying to fight this Article 5. And so I've debated several of their the Convention of States, state directors, general counsel. We've been trying to get Mike Ferris, one of their leaders, and he kind of runs around from us. But anyway, so that's what we're doing on that regard. I want to thank Frank for inviting me to speak here to this very special group. I've been very impressed with not only your platform, but what I've seen of its commitment to action and especially to education. My initial contact with the party was through your South Dakota State Chair, Laura Stacy. Her concern over Article 5 prompted her to ask me to do a statewide tour speaking on the dangers of Article 5 and to educate the party and members and even legislators on that issue. And we drove probably over 1,000 miles around the state. She was running around gathering candidate petition signatures as I was speaking on the issue. So she was kind of using me as the bait for her signature trap, and I thought that was a great idea. And I can say if the rest of your state chairs are as energetic and enthusiastic as Lori, and I know Janine certainly is, I've worked with her, I'm predicting great things for this party. I was initially going to say that I didn't like the two-party system, but that's not really true because I've never experienced a two-party system. In my opinion, the Democrats and the GOP parties are different legs of the same pair of pants. The Democrats are controlled by collectivists and are promoting a socio-fascist system. The GOP is controlled by collectivists who are promoting a neo-fascism system. Neo-fascism is where the business interest controls government, unlike the traditional Nazi fascists where the government controlled business. Today, we're seeing the continuation of an Article 5 movement which was initiated by collectivists through the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation over 50 years ago. Today, it's being promoted by collectivists backed by such as the Koch brothers and George Soros. This move to collectivism started in the late 1800s by the great industrialists and international bankers such as J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, and the Rothschilds. They are the ones responsible for the Federal Reserve Act, the 16th Amendment, and conversion of the militia of the states to a standing federal army called the National Guard. Sustainable development, Common Core, which is sustainable education, and sustainable medicine, which is Obamacare. And how did we get here? I was invited to speak at a Patriot Group's New Year's Eve party in 2011, and it was a family event. So on the way, my son leans over the seat and he asked me, "Dad, what is the most popular sucker in the world?" And I had to confess, I didn't know. And he said, "Dad, dum-dums." I thought about it for a second and I realized what a profound statement my son had made. Dum-dums really are the most popular suckers, and as P.T. Barnum had said, a sucker is born every minute. It is our own ignorance which has allowed us to be suckered into giving up our liberty inch by inch and now leaps and bounds. The incompetent and corrupt politicians we keep sending to Washington, D.C., and the state capitals are a reflection of we the people. It is our ignorance which has allowed us to be suckered into giving up our liberty. Somewhere along the way, we have lost our faith and our courage. It is our loss of faith that now allows us to vote for the lesser of two evils. Try as I might, I cannot find anything in my Bible where the Lord has said, "Thou shalt support the lesser of two evils." We the people are largely driven by fear in a state of self-inflicted ignorance and confusion, and that, my friends, is the devil's workshop. The GOP and Democrats only survive because of the ignorance of the citizenry and our lack of faith. This creates a potential competitive advantage for the Constitution Party if it lives up to its namesake. Let's have a little political science quiz. What are the fundamental principles on which our republic was established? Does anybody know? Judeo-Christian principles. Before a person can take a political office, how many oaths must they take? Just lift up your hand. Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? How many oaths do they take? They take 2. How many of you know what state nullification is? How many of you believe in state nullification? It's a myth. What we really have is something much stronger. It's called constitutional nullification under the Supremacy Clause. And if you read that, you'll find out there can be no state nullification because there are no unconstitutional laws. They are automatically nullified. Automatically nullified. What are the constituent parts of the federal government? Are they the executive, legislative, and judicial branches? Is that true or is that false? That's false. The federal government is comprised of the central government in Washington, D.C., the states, and the people themselves. That is our federal government. How many of you have heard of allegiance and protection? How many of you know what it is? Well, I guess you haven't heard of it, you wouldn't know. But you all, I'm sure, started your day by pledging your allegiance to the flag. That is allegiance and protection. It's an ancient, inherent principle of sovereignty. The Apostle Paul invoked it at least 3 times to save his life. Look at Acts 16, 22, and 23. It's referred to 3 times in the Declaration of Independence, and there are scores of law cases that refer to it. It is fundamental to our republic. How many of you know the definition of sovereignty and how it applies to our government? Do you know what the Federalist principle of voluntary cooperation is? Do any of you know what that is? Some people mistake that for nullification. Now, how about an issue quiz? Do you know what sustainable development is and upon what theory it is based? How many know what sustainable development really is about? I know some of you do. Do you know what the different components of sustainable development are? And I've just talked about those. We have comprehensive planning, we have sustainable medicine, which is Obamacare, and we have sustainable education, Common Core. Does everybody understand that Common Core is being implemented globally? It's not called Common Core. What are the common law entities that were meant to protect the interest and the continuity of sovereignty? Does anybody know what those 3 entities are? One of them is over 1,000 years old. It's the sheriff, the militia, the militia of the states, and the grand jury. If you do not know or understand these political principles, you cannot be an effective citizen, and you're not qualified to be a public servant. To live up to your name and to capture a competitive advantage over other parties, you must be sure your candidates are educated on the Constitution, the principles of federalism, and allegiance and protection and sovereignty before they take office, because it's not an on-the-job training situation. Of course, your members should be educated on these as well, and you should push for the education of the general public so they can understand and see that the Constitution Party is a political and liberty oasis. If you only pay lip service to the Constitution and just wave a few conservative principles around, you will be bad, and you will probably even be worse than the GOP because you called yourself the Constitution Party. So you've established a bar that you need to live up to. If you put up candidates because they are more electable than more qualified, you will be guilty of the same corruption followed by the GOP and the Democrats. Now let's look at the Article 5 movement in particular. The Article 5 movement is an effort to change our federal Constitution through or by an end run around Article 5 of the Constitution. Article 5 allows for the calling of a national convention to propose amendments to our Constitution. I believe that many of the grassroots people working with the promoters of Article 5 are doing so out of a patriotic motive, but they are uninformed and they are misinformed. I do not attribute innocent motives to the major promoters of this effort, past or present. Now I want to get into how this movement was initiated in the early history of the movement. In 1963, the Ford Foundation gave $16.5 million to the Fund for the Republic, which set up the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Ford funded the center with $25 million. In today's numbers, that amount would be somewhere between $500 million and $1.2 billion. They were serious about this. The Ford Foundation hired a liberal Columbia University professor by the name of Rex Tugwell to oversee the project. Tugwell hired 100 academics and professors, no doubt liberal professors, to assist in this effort. Tugwell was an internationalist, or what we would call a globalist today. He was on the committee to frame a world constitution. He lived in Russia for several years and liked their system. He returned to America and went to work for FDR's presidential campaign, and subsequently FDR appointed him to a position in the Ag Department. He was the head of FDR's New Deal Brain Trust to develop and implement laws to change our government and our society. The center released a book in 1973 with Tugwell's new state constitution. It called for the elimination of the states, with the federal regions to take over their place. In 1973 through 76, the Senate president and Tugwell friend Nelson Rockefeller promoted the Tugwell Constitution and tried to get an open Article 5 going under the context or pretext of a balanced budget amendment. The effort failed. In the mid-'80s, the promoters pushed for a limited Article 5, promoting a balanced budget amendment again. This time, a Rockefeller Foundation was involved as well, and they were working through an NGO, a non-governmental organization. During this time, Chief Justice Warren Burger was approached by a group of quote-unquote professors trying to get him to promote a limited Article 5 and showing him a proposed constitution that abolished the states and set up the federal regions in their place. Again, it was the Tugwell Constitution. The judge believed that the Article 5 could not be limited, and eliminating the states made no sense to him. Beginning in 2009, the promoters returned, promoting a limited convention of states, stressing the states' control over such. Now I want to talk about the current promoters of the Article 5. The primary supporters of Article 5, of the Article 5 campaign, are associated with the State Policy Network. The State Policy Network is what I call a hub organization. So it's an organization that other organizations join so they can coordinate their efforts. The State Policy Network is funded by the Charles Koch Foundation and the Castle Rock Foundation. That's the Coors family. The members of that organization, and most of which support an Article 5, are as follows. These are some of the members. The Heritage Foundation, they support an Article 5. They've also been paying Rush Limbaugh millions of dollars since 2009. I wonder why Rush Limbaugh supports an Article 5. Heritage Foundation is funded by Charles Koch Foundation, Castle Rock Foundation, and Adolph Coors Foundation. Freedom Works also supports an Article 5. They're the ones that have been paying Glenn Beck millions of dollars since 2010. I wonder why Glenn Beck supports an Article 5. The Cato Institute supports an Article 5, and that is supported primarily by David H. Koch. The Independence Institute supports an Article 5. That's supported by Charles Koch Foundation, the Castle Rock Foundation, and that's where Professor Rob Nettleson hangs out. He's also a big promoter of the Article 5. The Goldwater Institute supports an Article 5, funded by the Charles Koch Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, and Mark Levine has been paid millions of dollars from the Americans for Prosperity. So why does Mark Levine support in Article 5? That's interesting, isn't it? The Americans for Prosperity are funded primarily, well, their chairman, co-founder is Richard H. Fink, an executive and founder of the Koch Industries. The Americans for Prosperity are funded through David H. Koch. They're also funded through the Americans for Prosperity Foundation, headed by David H. Koch, They're funded through the Freedom Partners, a member of which is Richard H. Fink. And the Freedom Partners also support and fund the Tea Party Patriots. They support an Article 5. I wonder why. I wonder why they're involved in that. The Freedom Partners also support and fund the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the most un-American organizations in this country. It supports open borders and amnesty, Common Core, and sustainable development. The Amend America organization has over 4,000 progressive organizations promoting an Article 5, many of which are associated with George Soros. As usual, the people are in between, are caught in between the gangmanship of two different allegedly opposed organizations that are really working together for one goal. In 2011, Mark Meckler, the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots, co-hosted a conference on constitutional convention with a liberal law professor at Harvard Law School. Attendees were a who's who of progressive organizations such as Move On, the Green Party, and Occupy, Code Pink, etc., many of whom were funded by George Soros. Mark Meckler now heads up a primary group promoting an Article 5, including through the Convention of States project headed by Mike Ferris. The pretext of this movement is that the federal government, or what I call, the founders called the central government, is not following the Constitution, so we need to change the Constitution. The only relevant question you need to ask yourself is this: can we reasonably believe that the corrupt politicians who have been violating their sacred and solemn oath to support the Constitution for nearly 100 years will all of a sudden start following a newly amended Constitution? This requires us to suspend reality and disregard our past experience. It requires us, in essence, to become a sucker once again. All other issues which are raised by the promoters and even some of our fellow opponents to this movement are not relevant and are a dangerous distraction. The proponents want us to discuss the rules of the convention, who controls the convention, who and how delegates will be selected. They want to talk about particular amendments, and none of this is relevant. When I debate the Convention of States leadership, I concede all these points. I take those arguments off the table. Now I want to discuss some of these issues to show you the lack of credibility that these folks have. So we're going to talk about some of the myths and deceptions that they promote. But again, remember, these are not really relevant to the issue or what you need to ask yourself to resolve the issue. The promoters want you to believe that the purpose of an Article 5 is to rein in the federal government. If you understand the Constitution and the Federalist principles, you understand this is false. In fact, you can come to this conclusion based on common sense. The central government and the states were to be contained by each other in conjunction with the sovereign citizens as a particular situation required. And I would refer you to the Federalist Papers, including numbers 27 and 28 for details on that. The framers understood that a paper document cannot protect itself, let alone our liberty. We, the people, are the first and the last lines of defense. The first is by political involvement, and the last is by force. The primary protection from the central government and its standing army was the militia of the several states. The authority and duty, that means it is mandated, it's not a choice, it's a mandate, of the states was to provide such protection comes from two sources. The first and primary source is the duty of protection the states as sovereign entities owe their citizens under the ancient inherent sovereign principle of allegiance and protection. Madison referred to this principle when he stated in the 1798 Virginia Resolves that the states, quote, have the right and are duty bound to interpose against infringements, and he's referring to the central government. He also noted that the state legislators, the assembly, had a duty to watch over and oppose every infraction of these principles, which constitute the only basis of the Union. We have a national project on the 2012 NADA, National Defense Authorization Act, trying to get states, city and county governments to pass legislation resolutions against the NADA. And invariably what we hear is politicians that say, well, that's a federal issue. We don't have anything to do with the federal government. And that's nonsense. They're part of the federal government. The second source of this duty is the fact that all state officers are sworn under Article 6, Clause 3 of the Federal Constitution to support the Constitution. This, in essence, makes them federal officers. This oath is a thread that binds the Federalist system together. The oath to support is one of two oaths all political officers, both state and federal, are required to take before they can assume office. This oath is, number one, personal, as is the oath of office, It is active, not passive, and affirmative. It is not enough that they not violate the Constitution. They must defend it when others attempt to violate the Constitution. It is unlimited geographically and politically, unlike the oath of office, which is limited to a political and geographic area. It is perpetual. It is a lifetime oath, unlike the oath of office, which ends with one's term in office. And I don't understand this, but the military people seem to understand their oath is forever. But most of the rest of the people do not understand that. People need to understand it. The fundamental implicit assertion by one taking this oath is that they have a working knowledge of the Constitution before they take office. So you have to train your candidates not to violate that oath the first thing by taking an oath that they're not prepared to take. Under this oath, one may not propose, sponsor, support, vote for, or enforce an unconstitutional action. There is no such thing as an unconstitutional law under Article 6, Clause 2. What's more is that they have a duty to resist any such proposal or enactment. The primary fallacy of the promoters is that an out-of-control federal government, which is one not obeying the Constitution, can be reined in by amending the Constitution, which they themselves acknowledge is without fault. If the Constitution's not the problem, why is amending it the solution? If politicians, state and central, have not honored their sacred oath to support the Constitution for 100 years, certainly since the 1903 Dick Act, which eliminated the state's militia, why would we be foolish enough to believe they would follow an amended Constitution? The Constitution's party own resolution says it quite nicely. Whereas the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States have been our nation's stand and title of liberty respectfully for more than 2 centuries, and whereas the freedom and liberty of all Americans can and will be continue to be maintained by adherence to the principles contained therein. That's all we need to do is obey the Constitution, right? Another myth is about who calls the convention, and this is a little lesson from Kansas, but this goes on everywhere. The promoters also say the states call the convention. I spoke to a Kansas legislator who is also an attorney and a retired judge. He was 3 times sworn to follow the Constitution, and 3 times he asserted implicitly that he had a working knowledge of the Constitution. He's considered a conservative, and he probably is one of the better politicians we have in Kansas. He told me the states call, quote unquote, the convention. I, of course, promptly informed his discretion, as Jefferson had directed us to do, that it was Congress that called the convention, and he again noted my error. I countered by pulling out my pocket Constitution and reading to him Article 5, and he promptly requested that I turn over my Constitution to him so he could read it. In obvious embarrassment, he said, well, yes, but the call's purely ministerial. There is an old saying that says, when an honest man realizes he is in error, one of 2 things happens. He either stops being in error or he stops being an honest man. My friend compounded his error with another error. Last Wednesday night, I handed the same pocket Constitution to my now 14-year-old son, the sucker boy, and asked him to read Article 5 and tell me who calls the convention. And his response was, Congress calls the convention, Dad. My son has not yet graduated from middle school. He has not had any legal training, and he has never served as a judicial officer. Yet he was able to discern that Congress calls the Article 5 convention. This legislature has been supporting an Article 5 convention since sometime after March 2013. He attended a Mount Vernon Article 5 planning conference, which was coordinated with an American Legislative Exchange Council meeting, another organization supported by the Koch brothers, and which supports an Article 5. Yet when asked this simple fundamental question about Article 5, he could not correctly answer it. He gave me the pat answer provided by ALEC and the Convention of States that they're putting out. And pray tell, who do you think loaded his gun? The other myth is that they can control in Article 5 by an interstate compact. The Kansas Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, a GOP conservative and favorite son of the Kansas GOP party, is not only supporting an Article 5 convention, which he deceptively calls a convention of states, he supports an interstate compact with an Article 5 convention. You can refer to Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 for the details on that. The pretext of such is it gives the states control and allows one to know in advance how a convention will turn out. In reality, it is an unconstitutional attempt to do an end run around the Constitution's requirement that amendments proposed be made by one of two deliberative bodies, Congress or the convention called by Congress. Kobach is also promoting a health care compact, which is also unconstitutional, and an attempt to do an end run around the Constitution, and perhaps as a stealth attempt to trigger a constitutional convention. This was promoted, the health care compact is promoted by an organization founded by a gentleman with ties to the Koch brothers. Okay, the myth about the Article 5 being controlled by the states. A convention of states is a convention called by one or more states and attended by two or more states. It is an intrastate affair, brought together by and under the authority of one of the states. There have been many conventions of states, including before our current Constitution. An Article 5 convention is called by Congress under the authority of the federal Constitution. The Amendments Convention is a federal body, and it is undertaking federal activity. In fact, a states act in applying for an Article 5 convention and its ratification of a proposed amendment is done under federal constitutional authority, not under authority of the state. Amendments Constitution versus the Constitutional Convention. This is another myth. The promoters also assert that an Article 5 convention is an amendments convention, not a constitutional convention, and this is technically true. But what you must remember is three things which I hope you do not know. The first is the difference between an amendments convention and a constitutional convention is a distinction without a difference. A constitutional convention is a convention to write a constitution. An amendments convention is an amendment to an existing constitution. But the Constitution sets no limits on the scope of amendments. Therefore, the amendment can be the change of one comma in the Constitution, or it can be the change of everything but one comma in the Constitution. Second, no one is really opposed to a change in the Constitution's language per se. The concern that we have is that there may be a change in our form of government or the citizen's liberty or sovereignty status. Our federal system, our liberties, could be extinguished with 7 little words. The sovereignty of the states is abolished. Third, it is possible for an amendments convention to change into a constitutional convention. We've seen that happen one other time. Amen. The myth of the limited versus unlimited convention. The promoters also say an Article 5 convention can and will be limited. There is no basis for such assertion. Robert Kelly, the National Staff Counsel for the Convention of States, admitted in graphic detail in a videotaped debate with Patriot Coalition National Director Jeff Lewis that the Convention of States application opens all the Constitution up for amendment except Article 7. Does anybody know why Article 7 is not affected? Because it's
where it says where the original Constitution was passed.
exactly, it's moot now. The Convention of States model's language asks for a convention to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Does anybody know what the Constitution does? In reality, there is no way to limit the scope of an Article 15 convention, an Article 5 convention, and those that have been promoting such for over 50 years know it. Now I'd like to make just a couple quick comments on the Bundy situation because, again, it relates to our lack of knowledge of what's going on in our fundamental principles. Such situation clearly highlights the governmental abuses which are not being addressed. It will be used by some to promote an Article 5. We are investigating the issue to get the real facts, and the facts that we know appear to be that the Bundy cattle involved were not on the Bundy property. 2, the land, at least initially, was owned by the federal government. 3, the issue of whose land it is, state or federal, is controlled by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 and 18, and Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 and 2. Such largely depends on how the federal government acquired the land. But the real issues which are not being discussed are as follows. Number 1, sustainable development and legislation made in pursuance to such, including the Wildlife Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Park Service Organic Act. Number two, the undue amount of force brought to bear against citizens not only by the central government, but by the state and local governments. Clearly, the central government, with the cooperation of the states and local governments, have federalized and militarized law enforcement at all levels and are employing a strategy of shock and awe against anyone that gets in their master's way. This is the purpose of the fusion centers in the states. Does anybody know what a fusion center is? You need to look it up. It's a serious matter. Why do some citizens, number three, why do some citizens feel compelled to form a paramilitary group? The government uses these groups to malign the constitutional militia of the states by referring to these groups as militia and failing to point out such groups are not militia when these groups call themselves such. And they do a disservice to the Constitution when they call themselves the militia. When these groups use that term, they're doing a disservice to our Constitution. Citizens feel compelled to enter into such groups because they no longer trust their government. In fact, we fear our government, and because the states no longer maintain a state militia as required by the Constitution and allegiance and protection. Number four, why are the state officers, including the sheriff, not fulfilling their duty to protect the rights, not the persons, but the rights of the citizens? The answer is in large part because the states are complicit with the criminal, treasonous activity of the central government in violating their oath to support the Constitution and our liberty. The central government has no authority to offer educational dollars or housing dollars or sustainable community dollars or regional planning dollars or transportation dollars. The states have no authority to accept such unconstitutional payments and in fact are under duty not to accept and to try to resist those. The central government and the states are violating Article 7 of the Constitution, which requires a Republican form of government, and contrary to what some people say, that doesn't mean the GOP, in setting up a regional governance council or Soviets. So what are the solutions? The solution to the Republic's problem is simple but not easy. We must return to constitutional governance. That means the states need to put the federal government back in its box. Before that can happen, the citizens need to take back the states. To do this, the people need to be re-educated on the fundamental principles of the Republic and to be empowered to go on the offensive. State constitutional amendments need to be made. Number one, to give people the power to recall every state and local officer from the governor to the dog catcher. To give the people the power to pass laws themselves by initiative. To give the people the power to revoke laws through referendum. For the sheriffs and their common law authority need to be given full constitutional protection and return to their full common law authority, and this includes a posse comitatus. The states must revitalize the first clause of the Second Amendment and reinstitute their independent militia, which are under the state's strict control and supervision pursuant to allegiance and protection in the Constitution. For more on this, you can get information at the revitalizingthesecondamendment.com. It's rt2a.com. I'm general counsel for that organization. Sixth, the people's grand jury, both state and federal, must be returned to its common law authority and be protected constitutionally at the state level. We may not be able to put the fear of God back into our corrupt politicians, but we certainly can put the fear of the people back in them. Your cause is clear if you as a party truly want to restore the Grand Republic. You must first restore knowledge to your members and candidates, promote general education on the foundations of the Republic, empower the people to restore the protection of the people's sovereignty, take back the states, and never compromise on fundamental principles. Such compromises are like negotiating with cannibals over how much of you they will have for dinner. You will never win. There is no other party committed to such a plan of restoration. The GOP and Democrats are committed to maintaining themselves above all else, even at the expense of the Republic. They are willing to spend the American people's liberty to do this, and they're working together to accomplish it. Through the grace of and for the glory of God, this can be accomplished. The issue is, are you committed enough and are you moral enough? For the sake of liberty, I hope so.